Good afternoon. Lovely to be here this afternoon, and thank you, REBA, for inviting us back. So I just wanted to chat to you today a little bit about some of the work we've been doing on remote working, and particularly the impact that remote working can have on health and well-being. And why? Well, as many of you will know, we look after about 60% of the FTSE in terms of the health and well-being. And over the last 9 or 10 months, one of the things I'm hearing quite often from a lot of our clients is remote working. Should we be doing it? Shouldn't we be doing it? And if we are there things that we need to consider as we're doing it from a health and well-being perspective? So as Nuffield and as thought leaders and as an evidence-based organisation, we thought, well, the best thing for us to do will be to go and look at this in more detail, and hence this is where we are. So for a bit of context, I think the most interesting point here is in the last 10 years, we've seen about a 75% jump in remote working, which is huge. And we've seen roughly, that translates to about 5 million people working remotely. That's done in 2015, so we're probably up by about 6-7 million now. And those who work predominantly at home, we're looking at about 4 million. And there's a number of reasons for that, right? We know that we're getting better with our technology, so we're making it easier for people to work remotely. We know that we have stresses on our space and our overheads, so we know remote working is a way for us to start getting around that. But I think more practically, we know that remote working allows employees to try and link their home and work life in a much more manageable way. So one of the questions I'm often asked is, remote working, yes or no? Should I do it or shouldn't I do it? And I've put 2 quotes up here from some industry leaders that really reflect the 2 poles of that argument. So the first one at the top here from the chief exec at Yahoo says, to become the absolute best place to work, communication and collaboration will be important. So we need to be working side by side. That is why it's critical we are all present in our offices. So that's very much office-centric, office-focused, and maybe anti-remote working. If we look at the second quote below from Richard Branson, he says, it's easier to attract top talent when you're open and flexible. It's not effective or productive to force them to behave in a conventional way. So very much pro-remote working. And the reason I put that there is because really, this isn't the debate. You know, what we're interested in is the grey area in the middle here. It's about maximising the benefits of blended working and minimising or diminishing the potential negative impacts that may have. So we know work in general has a massive impact on health and well-being. You know, we wouldn't be here today listening to all these great talks if we didn't believe that. And we know it impacts on all of these things here, whether it's health, well-being, productivity, whatever it may be. But what we know is all of these things are important, right? And as soon as one of those things starts to fall out of kilter, everything starts to follow. And remote working actually could be one way in which we can maintain balance for all of these important things. So what do we try and do? So many of you will be familiar with reviews and systematic reviews. If you've ever read a Cochrane review, we very much took the same approach as that. And what we wanted to do is take all of the evidence that exists in this space currently and condense it down to try and find some sort of source of the truth. Now that's quite hard because it's quite a new area from a research perspective, but that was our aim. And what we really wanted to do is once we boiled that down, try and arrive at some practical recommendations around how we maximise the benefits of remote working. So what did we do? We took a whole variety of different studies and we took them from 1995 all the way through to 2019. And we looked at papers where participants worked remotely, and that was defined as spending at least 1 day of their working week away from the office. And we only used studies that used validated measures. There are numerous studies out there that measure all sorts of different things, but actually we don't always get to the true source of truth. So we started off with about, 350, 400 papers. And once we applied our framework and whittled those down, we actually ended up with 22 studies that were of a quality suitable to put into this review. Now you might look at that and you might think, well, that's quite a small amount of studies. Can we actually trust or rely on the information that's given us? And the answer is yes. And if we look at the number of individuals that actually covers, it's about 7,500. So yes, it's not the biggest population covered in the world, but actually we're pretty comfortable that the findings that I'll show you are robust and solid. We looked at small and large companies, looked at a variety of different sectors, a variety of different seniority levels within the workforce. And again, just a nod to say the quality range that we looked for was sort of the top 75% of quality in terms of papers. And then just a nod to say that we used papers that covered the age ranges of 18 to 60, and obviously a mixed gender population. So, results. This is an interesting one. So, as you can see here, this basically just reflects the volume of studies and the areas that they cover. And as you can see, stress and well-being is sort of that takes the lion's share of the areas that are covered. And then a little bit on productivity. But the real interesting thing here is that from a health perspective, when I say health, I'm talking more physical health, your blood pressure, your blood glucose, etc. Not a single study has been done to date that looks at the effect of remote working on those metrics. So just to say, whilst we've got a good starting point here, there's a lot more that we need to do to try and get to the bottom of this evidence. So if I just give a highlight of the effects of remote working on well-being, we look specifically at job satisfaction, need for recovery, and work-life balance. And overall, we found that the effect on well-being was pretty much positive. We found that we saw increases in job satisfaction, work-life balance, reduced turnover intentions, i.e. people not wishing to want to move and leave a current job or move on to a new topic. And we know that the effects of that were very much mediated by relationships and connectedness, and that's a theme that you'll see run throughout here. So, some factors to consider when thinking about the impact of this. Technology can improve communication. It sounds obvious, but we know that with that, we increase the amount of social connectedness, and we know that that means that people can improve their well-being. And I won't go through all of these in detail, but with well-being and remote working, autonomy is very important. So what we saw was people who were working remotely but were micromanaged actually tended to show less well-being. People want to be able to be trusted, to be able to feel that they can work autonomously within their own environment. We obviously have to be balanced, so we have to look at both sides of the coin. And where we see a negative effect of remote working, in circumstances where the home starts to become a place of demand and less a place of restoration and recovery, which is incredibly important when we try and have to switch off from that workplace and try and recover. And all of this is moderated by social connectedness. The more connected we are socially and professionally, the greater opportunity we have to improve well-being via remote working. If we move on to stress, we looked at job stress, exhaustion, and psychological strain as our main areas. And the relationship is mixed, to be honest. We're not really in a place where we can give a conclusive position on this one. But we know that remote working can lead to reduced work stress. We know that it can lead to reduced work exhaustion and, again, reduced turnover intentions. But, again, we know that actually if you go too far the other way and it isn't managed properly, it can lead to overload, ambiguity, and strain. And that ambiguity piece is really important because when we move away from the office setting, especially if you're out of the office setting more than you're in it, quite often people can lose track of what are your main focuses, what is that person's role and responsibility, and actually you'll start to then get tasks, jobs, start to have conversations that don't actually really relate to the stuff that you're doing. And actually as an individual, if you don't feel like you have a solid purpose or belonging or role, that's then when you start to see that stress increase, creeping, and have that cascade effect on all the negative areas. So what's important here? Sufficient organisational support is really important, bottom up and top down, and making sure that individuals always have that sense of purpose, making sure that they have very clearly defined roles and responsibilities, and that's communicated throughout the whole team, throughout the whole organisation. We mentioned ambiguity. It has to be very clear what that individual does, and we have to make sure that across an organisation, everyone understands what that individual's skill sets are and what they should be used for. And intensity of working, the reason I put this up here is because we've seen a correlation between intensity and then increased stress. So workload management is also very important when we're looking at remote working. It's all too easy to get up early, start at 7 just because your laptop's there, and next thing you know, it's 7 at night and you're still doing it. And actually, when we start to engage in those behaviours, At first we think it's fine, you might have been doing it for years, but at some point you will go off the edge of the cliff. So it's really important organisationally that we manage the workload of our employees and make sure that we monitor the ways in which they are working. And our productivity, this is an interesting one. As you saw from the pie chart, we only had 3 studies here, and annoyingly, one showed that it worked, one showed that it didn't, and one was somewhere in between. So we can't really draw on too much from here, but we looked at job performance and concentration, mainly as our outcomes. And where we saw the positive effects, what we saw was part-time teleworkers showed higher levels of concentration at home, and we all know what it's like. If you've been out of the office for a while and you go back in, everyone needs you for something, right? So it's really hard to focus on those tasks in hand. So makes sense and is slightly maybe a bit obvious. But then also we see the flip side again, and actually we can see that from a productivity perspective, that feeling of social isolation leads to a drop in productivity. So again, making sure that our employees feel connected, feel that they have purpose, even if they are working from home majority of the time, is really important. But overall, on balance, if we take all of the data from all of the studies, we haven't actually found a significant effect on concentration. So much more work is needed to be done in this area. And again, not a huge amount of factors to consider because we haven't got any conclusive results in that area. So that's, looking at it in a broad sense. But there are some individual differences in traits that I think we should pick up on that are actually quite important. So openness. People who are high on openness as a trait tend to adapt well to remote working. And actually, if you're looking at your organisation, these are some of the traits that you should consider. If you've got individuals who are quite closed, quite introverted, it might be an idea to try and increase the coaching, try and improve their openness, if you will, to try and ease them into a more flexible way of working. Rumination. Rumination is the process by which we get a thought in our heads. And it's often a negative thought, and then it slowly gets bigger and bigger, and we start to catastrophize, and then the world's going to end, and it's the worst scenario that's ever happened in the world. And what we find is remote workers are more susceptible to that, because quite often they're working in an isolated environment at home or somewhere else, and they don't have that sounding board. They don't have an opportunity to be able to talk about those things. And what we find is if you are high in rumination, then remote working can actually be bad for your well-being. So before anyone even engages in the thought of remote working, it's about tackling that rumination piece and actually getting people to understand how to deal with that and how to work through that. Connectedness, we've obviously spoken about throughout this. The more socially and professionally connected you are, the more likely you are to succeed through remote working. And that feeds into the isolation piece. Massively negatively associated with job performance. So really important that actually if your organisation is engaging in remote working, it is truly organisation-wide. It's accepted by the whole organisation and not just running pockets, because that will lead to social isolation of those employees. Won't spend much time on this. This is just sort of a high level looking at all the studies and whether remote working has a positive, negative or neutral effect overall across the domains that we looked at. And as you can see broadly, remote working, it's positive, but it is mixed. And the key thing again to say here is that there just isn't the volume of data yet to really hang our hat to say, yes, definitely do it, or definitely don't. But as I said at the start, that isn't the debate. Everyone has individual differences, organisations have differences throughout, and actually it's about finding the balance and finding the thing that works best for you as an individual and as an organisation. Practical guidelines, really straightforward, to be honest. Remote working will change the workplace dynamic. There's no doubt about it. You can't operate in a traditional way and then just have remote working as this thing on the side. It just doesn't work. It has to be organisational wide. And the fact of the matter is, it's not going anywhere. It's only going to increase. So actually, if we're not looking at it from an organisational perspective, we need to start looking at it. And this is interesting. I don't know if is Dawn here? So Dawn is the HR director at Morgan Sindall, and she gave us a really interesting quote, which was 10 to 15 years ago at interviews, everyone was asking about the car, about the salary, but actually the single biggest question she gets now is about the company's approach to flexible working. I think it just shows the value that is inherently instilled within remote working. And actually, if as an organisation you're not in a position to be able to articulate that and how you maximise that for the individual, it is going to affect the talent that you attract. So some final thought pieces for the future. There is no obvious perfect ratio for remote working. From the studies that showed a positive effect of remote working, there was a tendency to see that a 2-to-3 or a 3-to-2 ratio worked, but again, we have to look at our population as a whole, and actually some people that'll be really good, some people actually that won't be enough. So it's about finding that balance. The key thing that came out of all of this was that actually people will come in and we talk about remote working, and what we do is we say, here's your laptop, just go and do the job that you do here at home. And it doesn't work like that. It's a very different way of working, and actually what we need to do collectively is think about training and development for individuals and actually coach them in successful remote working and what it looks like and some of the strategies that they can employ to be effective for, working from home. Because it's not easy, if you've not done it before and you're new to remote working, it's not easy just to go home, set your laptop up and start working, because there will be differences. And then last point there, it is all based on the individual level. Depends on your workload, depends on your individual psychological traits. There is no single best way of doing remote working. It's about understanding the individuals and your employees that are engaged in this type of working and understanding what works for them. So that's me. Thank you for your attention, and I'm more than happy to answer any questions.